Welcome. Today we're undertaking a very careful examination of a set of sources that detail a deeply challenging story. Our goal, as always, is to give you a clear and thorough understanding of the facts, the context, and the full weight of the events as they are presented.
And this is a particularly sensitive subject. We're going to be looking at the source material concerning the murder of Ashling Murphy. Our approach will be strictly factual, focusing on the timeline of events, the investigation, the forensic evidence, and the legal process that ultimately brought her killer to justice.
Ashling Murphy was, by every single account in the sources, a truly vibrant person. She was just 23 years old, a primary school teacher, a very talented traditional Irish musician, and a dedicated camogie player. Her life was just so full of promise.
It was, and its sudden and brutal end in January of 2022 near Tullamore sent a shockwave across not just Ireland, but internationally as well.
The documents we've analyzed really cover the entire scope of this tragedy, from the very specific details of the attack on the Grand Canal towpath to the huge criminal investigation that zeroed in on Joseph Puka.
Right, and then all the way through the trial and the widespread national conversation that this murder ignited about violence against women. So our task here is to present that comprehensive record to you as responsibly as we can.
Before we get into the timeline of the crime itself, I think it's vital that we focus on the life Ashling Murphy led. The sources really emphasize her connections to her community, to her family, and her culture.
They absolutely do. Ashling was the youngest of three children, born in July 1998 and raised in Blue Ball, County Offaly. Her whole life seemed to be on a very clear and successful path. She went to the Sacred Heart School in Tullamore, then on to Mary Immaculate College in Limerick.
And she earned a Bachelor of Education there, graduating in October 2021.
That's right. And she'd already secured a full-time teaching position. She started in September 2021, just a few months before she was killed, teaching first-class pupils at Scoil Naom Council in Duro.
So she was living out her chosen career really just at the very beginning of it.
Exactly. And her life outside of the classroom was, well, it was just as full. Traditional Irish music was a huge part of her family. The sources even note that her father had performed with the Furies, who were a very well-known group.
And Ashley herself was an exceptionally gifted fiddle player.
She was. She performed all over the country with the National Orchestra of Comhaltas Sealtóirí Éireann. She played at major festivals, and she also gave private music lessons from her home.
On top of all that, she was an active sportswoman playing camogie for her college and her local club. And the sources also make it very clear that her personal life was just as settled and happy.
Yes. She and her boyfriend, Ryan Casey, had been together for over 5 years. They were in a very committed relationship and were planning to get married.
So the loss wasn't just of a young life, but of a whole future that they had planned together. It's just devastating.
It is. And it's against that backdrop of a life so fully lived that we have to turn to the digital evidence that recorded her final minutes on January 12, 2022.
And this technology, these wearable devices, they gave the prosecution a completely objective forensic anchor for the entire timeline.
An anchor is the perfect word for it.
So let's lay out that digital footprint. Ashling finished work at 2:00 in the afternoon. She was seen on CCTV just 7 minutes later walking to her car. She then drove a very short distance to the Dangeen Road car park in Tullamore, right next to the Grand Canal.
And the sources are very precise here. She began her walk along the towpath, heading east towards a landmark called Digby Bridge at exactly 2:51 p.m.
The key piece of evidence, as you mentioned, came from her Fitbit, a Versa 3 smartwatch.
Right, and that device had both an activity tracker and geolocation that was linked to her phone. So it was recording her movements and her physiological data in real time. The data shows her walking at a brisk pace, about 6.5 kilometers per hour.
The kind of pace you'd expect for a routine walk for exercise.
Exactly, it was purposeful. But then at precisely 3:21 p.m., that smooth, consistent data flow just stops cold.
And what does the device record at that moment?
At that exact moment, the Fitbit's data logs what the official report calls erratic fluctuations consistent with a violent attack. And this is what transforms a piece of personal tech into a silent, objective witness.
So it pinpoints the exact start of the assault.
It does. And following that initial struggle, her heart rate, as recorded by the device, begins to drop very, very rapidly. That decrease continues until 3:27 p.m. And then, the most critical piece of data, the device stops recording any heartbeat at all at 3:31 p.m.
So the sources give us this horrifyingly precise window for the attack. The entire struggle and the moment of her death, all established objectively before any human witnesses could even be found.
Yes. Now, moving to the physical nature of the crime, the source material describes the attacker overpowering her. He dragged her off the main towpath and into a very steep adjacent ditch that was filled with thick briars and thorns.
And the post-mortem findings detailed just how extreme the violence was.
The official cause of death was confirmed by the pathologist, Dr. Sally Ann Collis. It was cardiorespiratory arrest, which was a direct result of acute blood loss.
The specific injuries were just devastating. The sources document 11 separate stab wounds, all concentrated on the right side of her neck.
And those were in addition to a single, longer incision that went across the front of her neck. Dr. Collis confirmed these wounds severed major blood vessels, both the left and right jugular veins and the right carotid artery.
And there was another crucial detail from the post-mortem. The sources note that the assault also damaged her voice box.
Yes, and the implication of that is just profound. It means she was likely rendered unable to speak or to cry out for help effectively. It just dramatically limited her ability to alert anyone.
We also know she had defensive injuries on her hands.
That's right. The presence of those defensive wounds proves she fought back, and she fought back desperately. And those injuries, as we'll discuss, became a really vital part of the forensic case later on.
And all of these grim physical facts were then corroborated by eyewitnesses.
Correct. Crucial testimony came from two other teachers who happened to be jogging along the same path, Jenna Stack and Oife Marin.
They came upon the scene. What did they see initially?
At first, they noticed a distinctive mountain bike just lying in the hedge, and they thought maybe someone had just fallen off. But then Jenna Stack looked down into the ditch.
And she saw them.
She saw a man crouched over a woman, holding her down. She described seeing the woman's legs kicking vigorously in what she called a scissors-like motion. She said she knew instantly it was a struggle, a desperate cry for help.
And she challenged him, right?
She did. She shouted, "What are you doing?" And the man immediately shouted back, "Get away." The two women, believing they had interrupted a sexual assault and, crucially, having no phone with them, they ran to get help.
So their testimony provided that immediate human context for the violent attack that the Fitbit data had already recorded so clinically.
Exactly. And the sources note, when the first official responders arrived, they found her hand was snow white, which is a stark indicator of just how rapid and fatal the blood loss had been.
So, following the attack, the Gardaí and the emergency services, they did respond very quickly, even though the severity of her wounds meant the outcome was sadly inevitable.
Yes, a cyclist who had been alerted by those two joggers found her motionless in the ditch at 3:34 p.m., and he immediately called the Gardaí. Two officers were on the scene within 10 minutes.
And they began CPR straight away.
They did. Despite her obvious condition, they moved her body out of the ditch and onto the towpath to try and help with resuscitation efforts, and they continued that for over 10 minutes.
Paramedics arrived not long after that at 3:56 p.m. The source material includes testimony from one of them, Paul McCabe, who noted the extensive wounds to her neck.
And despite their efforts using a defibrillator, she was in what's clinically called a non-shockable rhythm. She showed, and I'm quoting here, no signs of life. She was pale, had no pulse, and her pupils were fixed and dilated.
And resuscitation was officially stopped shortly after 4 p.m.
Yes. The area was declared a crime scene, and she was formally pronounced dead at 5:51 p.m.
The post-mortem the next day just confirmed what we've already discussed: the 11 stab wounds, the single incision, and the acute blood loss.
And this was a really critical distinction to make publicly because the initial and highly inaccurate media reports were suggesting that she had been strangled. The pathology quickly established the factual truth. This was a lethal stabbing.
The reaction in Ireland, it went from shock to this widespread visceral grief, and then that grief just solidified into national outrage. It's difficult to think of a comparable event in recent Irish history that provoked such a unified and immediate response.
The sources really quantify that response.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of people attended vigils, not just across Ireland, Tullamore, Dublin, Belfast, Limerick, but internationally too.
Right. In cities like London, New York, Melbourne, Glasgow, this wasn't just a local tragedy. It became a transnational statement.
It did. And the reaction went straight to the very top. The president, Michael D. Higgins, released a statement of profound sympathy, honoring her short but brilliant and generous life. The Taoiseach at the time, Michael Martin, called it a violent and barbaric killing.
And he said it united the nation in solidarity and revulsion.
He did. And this is really where the reaction starts to transition from mourning into a call for legislative action. The focus very quickly shifted to the underlying systemic issues of women's safety and gender-based violence in Ireland.
The sources detail how this murder sparked these incredibly intense online debates about misogyny. Countless women began publicly sharing their own stories of harassment and violence.
And the political establishment responded directly to that huge public pressure. The Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, she promised a zero-tolerance approach, new laws, and a significant increase in state funding for women's shelters and support services.
The sources repeatedly call Ashling Murphy's death a watershed moment.
And it was. It directly accelerated the implementation of what had, until then, been just conceptual plans.
Yeah.
It pushed forward a 5-year government strategy to combat domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence.
And it was funded immediately.
That's the key. The plan was allocated $363 million. This wasn't just a political promise anymore. It turned these proposals into a funded, urgent reality with a speed that was just unprecedented.
Her funeral on January 18th became a real focal point for this national commemoration. It was held at St. Bridget's Church in Mount Bullis, and President Higgins was there, along with numerous government ministers.
It really underscored the political weight of the tragedy. And there was this incredibly powerful moment of national unity when schools and colleges across the entire country observed a minute's silence at 11 a.m.
And her former pupils, they formed a guard of honor holding red roses, a symbol of the life and the career that she had really just begun.
During the service, symbols of her life were brought to the altar: her fiddle, her camogie jersey, a family photo, and a school book. And the bishop, Tom Dinahan, spoke of the depraved act of violence, but he also acknowledged the unity it had forged across the country.
And the personal pain was just so raw. At the graveside, her boyfriend, Ryan Casey, spoke about their relationship, telling everyone, "She will always be my soulmate."
The international recognition of her loss was also significant. The sources note that King Charles III, who was then Prince Charles, and Queen Camilla later visited her family to express their personal condolences.
And this tragedy has created a very strong and ongoing legacy. Her family established the Ashling Murphy Memorial Fund.
Yes, it's a registered charity that's focused on supporting traditional Irish arts and culture for young people. Her memory is also cemented in other institutions. There are scholarships in her name at Mary Immaculate College and at Cumhaltas for excellence in traditional music.
Sporting trophies have been renamed for her as well. And crucially, a permanent memorial has been built at the site of her killing on the canal bank at Cappencur. It ensures that location remains a place of respectful remembrance.
The investigation itself launched immediately. It was a huge operation managed out of Tullamore Garda Station with more than 50 Gardaí involved.
But those initial days were really difficult, particularly in trying to identify the right person.
That's right. The sources confirmed there was an initial misstep. Just 2 hours after the murder, a 40-year-old man was detained based on some early, unrefined eyewitness descriptions.
But he was quickly cleared.
He was. Thankfully, he was eliminated from inquiries and released the very next day. But the unfortunate consequence of that brief detention was that the man became the target of these baseless online threats and accusations.
It just highlights the danger of public rumor in these kinds of high-profile cases.
Absolutely. The investigation's focus then shifted very rapidly to Jozef Puka, a Slovak national who had been living in Ireland since 2013.
How did he come onto their radar?
Well, the day after the murder on January 13th, Gardaí and paramedics were called to an apartment in Dublin. Puka was there, and he was claiming that he had been stabbed in a completely separate and unrelated assault in a place called Blanchardstown.
And right away, there were inconsistencies.
Immediate inconsistencies. He was being treated for 3 stab wounds to his abdomen, but they were superficial. They weren't fresh, and they weren't bleeding actively. But more importantly, Gardaí immediately noticed deep scratches all over his face, his head, and his arms.
And he tried to explain those away.
He did. He claimed he got them when he was being dragged during this supposed assault in Blanchardstown. But Detective Inspector Shane McCartan and his colleagues, they recognized those marks instantly. They looked exactly like what you would get if you had crawled through thick briars.
A detail that was highly consistent with the crime scene, where Ashling had been dragged into that overgrown ditch.
Precisely. And on top of that, his story about his movements the day before was just completely inconsistent. He claimed a friend drove him from Tullamore to Dublin, but the timeline, the details, they just didn't line up with any confirmed reports.
So that combination, the unexplained injuries that matched the crime scene and the inconsistent alibi, That's what elevated him to a person of interest.
A primary person of interest. And this led directly to the most pivotal moment in the entire investigation, the interview they conducted at St. James's Hospital on the evening of January 14th.
He was interviewed in a private room by two detectives with a third Garda sergeant present, and they used a Slovakian interpreter over a speakerphone.
Yes, the sources confirmed that after he had undergone surgery the night before, he was formally told that he was a person of interest in the murder. His response became the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution's case.
He confessed.
He did. He asked the interpreter to tell the detectives his exact words. I did it, that I killed her. But to tell him also that I did not do it intentionally, that I didn't want to do it, and that I'm very sorry I did it, that it happened.
He then signed a note, written in English by one of the detectives, which read, I did it, I murdered, I am the murderer.
Devastating evidence. But the real clincher, the one detail that proved his guilt beyond any doubt, was what he said next.
This was the non-public detail.
Exactly. It involved the specific mechanism of injury. He started talking about trying to quiet Ashling, and then he said, in English, I tell her go, I won't hurt you. When she pass, I cut her neck. She panic, I panic.
And that admission that he had cut her neck, that was a detail known only to the killer, the Gardai, and the pathologist.
Right. The media at that point were still running with the initial incorrect story that she had been strangled. So this key undisclosed fact created an undeniable link to the crime scene evidence. And it essentially sealed his fate.
He also admitted during that same conversation that the wounds he was being treated for, the ones in his abdomen, were self-inflicted.
He did. After that confession, the investigation just intensified, focusing on all the physical evidence linking him to the Grand Canal path, especially that distinctive black and green Falcon Storm mountain bike that was found at the scene.
Puka was then discharged from the hospital on January 18th.
And he was immediately arrested and taken to Tullamore Garda Station for formal processing, fingerprinting, DNA, blood samples. He was charged the following evening.
His first court appearance, the sources describe a really intense atmosphere.
It was. A large, angry crowd gathered outside the Tullamore District Court, shouting as he was brought inside. Ashling Murphy's family were there in the courtroom, holding framed photos of her. He was then remanded in custody.
And the sheer scale of this investigation, it just highlights the rigor of the Gardai's work.
It really does. The sources confirmed they reviewed something like 25,000 hours of CCTV footage. They used it to track both Pujeka's movements and Ashling's movements, linking him directly to that bicycle.
And when you combine that with the mobile forensics, her Fitbit, her smartphone, it created this meticulous reconstruction of events that really formed the bedrock of the prosecution's case.
The trial started in October 2023 at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. And it was a lengthy process, really defined by just the overwhelming weight of the prosecution's scientific and circumstantial evidence against the defense's shifting and ultimately unbelievable story.
Pushaka pleaded not guilty, which meant the prosecution had to methodically present every single piece of that evidence to the jury.
They did. But before the full trial got underway, the defense made a key legal challenge. They tried to get certain evidence excluded.
What specifically?
They argued to have the extensive CCTV footage thrown out, claiming it was a breach of Putoka's privacy rights. And they tried to exclude the hospital confession, arguing he was medically unfit because of the medication he was on at the time.
But the judge, Tony Hunt, he ruled all of it admissible.
He did. Regarding the confession, he was very clear. He stated that the Gardai are not legally required to get a medical assessment before interviewing a suspect, as long as they follow the standard caution procedures, which they had done.
And that ruling meant the jury heard the full, powerful confession, including that key detail about cutting her neck.
Yes. And to set the stage a little, the sources provide some background on the accused. Jozef Pušika was a Slovak Romani man who'd been living in Ireland since 2013. He moved to Tullamore in 2015.
At the time of the murder, he was living in a house with a large extended family, his wife, 2 brothers, their wives, and a total of 14 children between them.
He had stopped working a few years prior due to a reported back injury and was receiving disability allowance.
Now, the prosecution couldn't introduce his prior record as evidence for this specific murder charge, but the sources do note that he had been a person of interest in 2 previous assaults on women abroad.
Right, one in Prague and one in the UK. He also had a juvenile probation record in Slovakia. Again, this wasn't the basis for the conviction, but it provides some background context.
So, the physical and circumstantial evidence the prosecution presented, it was meticulously layered, starting with that Falcon Storm mountain bike.
Yes. CCTV footage placed him cycling that specific bike near the crime scene, both before and immediately after the time of the attack.
But the case went beyond just showing he was in the area. It demonstrated a pattern of targeting behavior just moments before the attack on Ashling.
That's a critical point. The Gardaí established that Puska had followed at least 2 other women in Tullamore that same afternoon. One of them, a woman named Anne-Marie Kelly, gave really compelling testimony.
What did she say?
She said that Puska was following her slowly as she walked her dog. She actively tried to get away from him by taking a road along the canal. It was particularly muddy, hoping he wouldn't follow her on his bike.
But he did.
He did. She testified that he kept following her on foot, pushing his bike, until she reached Digby Bridge, where the presence of other people seemed to make him turn away.
And that evidence was crucial for showing that he was actively pursuing women in that area, suggesting this wasn't just some random, spontaneous encounter.
Exactly. It suggested premeditation. Then, the forensic link to the bike itself proved to be scientifically irrefutable. A fingerprint matching Pusha's right ring finger was found on the underside of the saddle.
And there was also DNA on the bike.
Yes, swabs taken from the handlebars yielded a DNA profile. A forensic scientist testified that when they compared it to Puka's blood sample, there was a 1 in a billion chance of that DNA belonging to anyone other than him.
1 in a billion. That level of certainty just removes any reasonable doubt about him handling that bike.
It does. But now let's talk about what was probably the most powerful and unique piece of forensic evidence, the piece that directly linked Puka to the violent struggle itself. And that's the findings from beneath Ashling's fingernails.
For our listeners, the technique they used here is really important to understand.
It is, absolutely. The challenge when you have a sample from under a victim's fingernails is that you expect to find mixed DNA, the victims and the attackers. So you have to isolate the attacker's profile.
And they did that using something called YSTR profile analysis. What is that exactly?
The YSTR analysis focuses exclusively on the Y chromosome, which is only carried by males and is passed down from father to son. Since Ashling Murphy was female, using this method allowed the scientists to completely filter out her own DNA profile and focus only on the male DNA that was present.
So it was the most effective way to find the attacker's DNA that was captured while she was fighting for her life?
Exactly. And the YSTR profile they isolated from under her fingernails was a match to Pusha's blood sample. The scientists testified that the chance of this male DNA coming from someone unrelated to him was about 1 in 14,000.
And the prosecution used this to argue, definitively, that Ashling Murphy had scratched and fought her attacker in her final moments, securing his DNA and providing that final, incontrovertible link.
So you have the full picture, his fingerprint and his DNA, with 1 in a billion certainty on the bike. His targeting behavior just moments before. His specific confession with a detail only the killer knew. And now, his DNA under her fingernails, proving she fought him.
And against all of that scientific certainty, Pushika took the stand and offered a very different narrative.
A fantastic narrative is one way to put it. Speaking through an interpreter, he claimed he was the victim of an attack by an unknown masked man. He said this same masked man then attacked Ashling Murphy. Pusha claimed he just tried to help her before crawling into a ditch out of fear.
He also claimed he couldn't remember confessing at all.
Right, citing memory problems. Now, the defense spent a lot of time trying to discredit that hospital confession. They brought in an expert witness who suggested Pusha might have been confused or irrational because of a dose of oxycodone he'd received a couple of hours before the interview.
A standard legal strategy. If you can't refute the physical evidence, try to cast doubt on the confession.
Precisely. But the prosecution countered it very effectively. They brought in their own expert in toxicology, who testified that the 8.25 milligram dose of oxycodone was clinically low and would have had no influence on his behavior or his understanding.
So they neutralized that argument.
They did. The expert said plainly there was no evidence to suggest his admission was related to any drug. In their closing argument, the prosecution just forcefully highlighted all the lies and inconsistencies in Pusha's accounts, describing his defense as a structure of lies and mistruths, some of which I say are absolutely foul and contemptible.
And they told the jury the evidence was overwhelming.
It's just worth noting one final thing about the trial, and that's motive. No clear, specific motive for the murder was ever established. The rumor that Ashling might have known Pusha and was killed for reporting him to TUSLA, the child welfare agency, was formally debunked by the Gardaí.
However, the police investigation did establish that Pusha had been very active on dating apps in the weeks before the murder.
Yes, messaging with up to 8 women in the area. The police speculation, as it's presented in the sources, was that he may have been targeting women for sexual assault and that he killed Ashling Murphy when she fought back against his attack with such ferocity.
After all the weeks of evidence, the jury deliberated for a remarkably short time.
Just 2 hours. Then they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on November 9th, 2023. That speed just reflected the incredible strength of the evidence.
And the judge, Tony Hunt, his reaction was very striking. He immediately said he was relieved the jury hadn't wasted time considering what he called the nonsense Puka had offered as a defense.
His words from the bench were incredibly powerful. He said, "We have evil in this room, no doubt about that."
Pusha was sentenced to mandatory life imprisonment on November 17th. And at that hearing, Judge Hunt actually criticized Irish sentencing restrictions.
He did. He noted that mandatory life sentences still allow for parole eligibility after, often, just 12 years. He argued that judges should have the power, like they do in other countries, to set specific minimum terms for the most heinous crimes like this one.
And before that sentencing, the court heard the victim impact statements, a critical and just gut-wrenching part of the proceedings.
The sources really dedicate a lot of attention to these statements. Ashling's mother's statement was read to the court, and it focused on that parental guilt of failing to protect her darling Ashling. She called Puka an evil monster who should never see the light of day again.
Her sister's statement focused on the loss of their shared bond over music. She said Ashling's pink fiddle case now lies covered in dust, and that for her, it was the hardest and cruelest reminder we will never play together again.
She spoke directly to the killer in her statement, saying Ashling's last 10 minutes on this earth must have felt like the longest 10 minutes of her life.
And her boyfriend, Ryan Casey, he detailed their plans to marry and start a family, all of which were just annihilated. He said directly to Putha, "Because of you, I lost my Ashling. I have lost everything I have ever wanted in life."
Casey also pointedly mentioned Pusha's demeanor during the trial, noting how he smirked, "You smiled and showed zero remorse." He summarized the killer as the epitome of pure evil.
The legal fallout didn't end with Puchka. 5 of his family members were subsequently charged with obstructing the investigation.
Right. This secondary process focused on what the family did in the immediate aftermath of the murder. The trial for his 2 brothers, Merrick and Lubomir Jr., showed they had actively withheld critical information.
They knew he had come home injured that night.
They knew that, and they failed to disclose that Pusha had admitted to them he had cut or killed a woman. They also helped him travel to Dublin that night to get treatment and to try and establish a false alibi.
And the 2 sisters-in-law, they were charged with destroying physical evidence.
Yes, Josefina Grunzova and Viera Gajeva. The specific charge was that they burned his blood-stained clothing in their fireplace, clearly knowing he'd committed a crime and with the intent to impede the investigation.
And what was the outcome of that trial?
In June 2025, the jury returned guilty verdicts. The brothers were found guilty of withholding information. The sisters-in-law were found guilty of destroying evidence. And Puka's wife, Lucia Istokova, had already pleaded guilty to withholding information before the trial.
And their sentences.
In October 2025, the men, Merrick and Lubomir Jr., were sentenced to 30 months in prison. The women received suspended sentences. The judge, in delivering those lighter sentences, noted that she accepted that women in Roma culture often did what they were told.
And finally, there was one more unexpected legal action that came directly out of those victim impact statements.
Yes. Ryan Casey's statement included comments that were critical of Puka's reliance on Irish social housing and welfare. These specific comments became quite controversial.
A journalist, Kitty Holland, criticized them on a BBC broadcast.
She did. She said those parts of his statement amounted to incitement to hatred and suggested he was being held up as a hero by the far right.
And Casey sued the BBC for defamation.
He did, in August 2024. The situation was resolved almost a year later, in July 2025. The BBC settled the case out of court, paying damages in Casey's legal costs.
And as part of that settlement, the BBC issued a statement clarifying that they didn't consider him a racist or someone trying to incite hatred.
Correct. And Casey released his own statement, saying his action was about accountability and dignity for Ashling and for all victims, and about advocating for a society free of gaslighting, blacklisting, or censorship.
So when we look at the entire record of this case, what really defines it is this brutal mix of violence, the incredibly rapid legislative reaction it caused, and the sheer rigor of the legal process that ensured justice was done.
That's right. The conviction was secured not by one single thing, but by a powerful synthesis of all the facts. They wove together the undeniable scientific certainty of the forensics, that 1 in a billion DNA match, the proof of self-defense under her fingernails, with the irrefutable timeline from her Fitbit.
And of course, the specific, detailed admission in his own confession.
Exactly. It was a case the defense simply could not overcome.
And what we're left with is the profound societal impact. This tragic event became a lightning rod for legislative change in Ireland, accelerating serious government investment and political focus on gender-based violence, all driven by the memory of a young teacher and musician attacked in broad daylight.
This case offers a crucial point for reflection that really goes beyond the specifics of the crime and into the future of jurisprudence. We've seen how technology, specifically Ashling Murphy's Fitbit smartwatch, acted as an undeniable silent witness. It provided the critical temporal and physiological data about her last moments. The thought we'd like to leave you with is this. In an era where a single runner's watch can hold the definitive proof of a life's last moments, how must our legal and judicial frameworks continue to evolve to protect and govern this new, powerful class of digital and biometric evidence?
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth exploration of the source material. Thanks for listening.